Welcome, dear listener, to a journey back through time, back to April of 1912, to a ship that was called Unsinkable, to a voyage that captured the world's imagination, to a night that would be remembered forever. Tonight we sail together aboard the RMS Titanic, through calm seas and starlit skies, through moments of luxury and wonder, toward a tragedy that changed how we think about progress, about safety, about the fragility of human confidence in the face of nature's power. Before we embark on this journey, I invite you to settle yourself comfortably. Adjust your pillows just so, draw your blankets close. Take a slow, deep breath in, hold it for a moment, then release it slowly, letting tension flow away with your breath. This is a story for drifting, for releasing, for allowing yourself to float through history like a ship upon calm water. If you find peace in these historical journeys, please press like. If you wish to travel with me through more distant nights and forgotten moments, subscribe and share your thoughts. Your presence here makes this space warmer, makes these old stories live again. Now, let us step back through the years, back to 1912, to Southampton, to the greatest ship the world had ever seen, to the Titanic, and to the night when the impossible happened, when the unsinkable ship met the ocean floor, when more than 1,500 souls passed from life into legend. Southampton. Departure day. The morning of April 10th, 1912, dawned clear and bright over Southampton, the great port city on England's southern coast. The air carried the salt smell of the sea, the sharp tang of coal smoke from countless chimneys, and underneath it all, an electric feeling of anticipation, of something momentous about to happen. In the harbour, dominating the skyline, dwarfing every other vessel in sight, sat the RMS Titanic. She was vast beyond comprehension, 882 feet long, nearly 100 feet wide, her hull rising 11 stories above the waterline. She was painted black and white, her 4 funnels towering above her decks, 3 of them functional, the 4th added for aesthetic balance, for symmetry, for the appearance of even greater power than she already possessed. She was the largest moving object ever created by human hands. She displaced more than 50,000 tons. She could carry more than 2,000 passengers and nearly 900 crew members. She represented the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian engineering, the finest achievement of the age of steam and steel, proof positive that humanity had conquered the ocean, had bent nature to its will through ingenuity and industry. The White Star Line had spared no expense in her construction. She had taken 3 years to build, employed more than 3,000 workers, cost £1.5 million sterling, a fortune almost beyond calculation. She was fitted with the most advanced safety features of the era, 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed with the flip of a switch, a double-bottom hull, the latest in wireless telegraph equipment, enough lifeboats to satisfy and exceed the Board of Trade regulations of the time. She was, everyone agreed, unsinkable. Not just unlikely to sink, not just very safe, but actually unsinkable. The designers said so, the builders said so, the newspapers said so. It was taken as fact, as certain as the sunrise, as reliable as the tides. The Titanic could not sink. It was impossible. And so on this bright April morning, passengers began to arrive at the White Star dock to board this marvel, this floating palace, this ship that would carry them across the Atlantic in unprecedented luxury and absolute safety. They came by train from London, by carriage from nearby towns, by foot from Southampton itself. They came with luggage and excitement, with hope and anticipation, with tickets that represented everything from modest savings, carefully accumulated, to casual expenditure of wealth so vast it barely registered as an expense. The first-class passengers arrived in their finest traveling clothes, the men in tailored suits and overcoats, the women in long dresses and elaborate hats, their jewelry catching the spring sunlight. They were accompanied by maids and valets, by stewards carrying trunks and hat boxes, by the entire apparatus of Edwardian wealth making its way from land to ship. They walked up the first-class gangway with confidence, with ownership, with the certainty that they belonged in these spaces of luxury and privilege. Among them was John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, traveling with his young pregnant wife, Madeline. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, the American mining magnate. There was Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department store, traveling with his wife Ida, married for decades, still deeply devoted to each other. There was Margaret Brown, who would later be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, a woman of wealth, but also of spirit and courage that would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The second-class passengers arrived with equal excitement but less fanfare. They were professionals and merchants, teachers and clergymen, families of comfortable means, but not great wealth. Their accommodations aboard Titanic would have been considered first class on most other ships, would have been luxurious by any normal standard. They represented the great middle class of the early 20th century, people who'd worked hard, saved carefully, and could now afford to cross the ocean in genuine comfort. The third-class passengers, called steerage on other vessels, but given the more dignified name of third class on Titanic, arrived in the greatest numbers. They were immigrants mostly, leaving Europe for America, for the promise of new lives, for opportunity, for escape from poverty or persecution, or simply the desire to start fresh in a new land. They carried everything they owned in bundles and cheap cases, wore their best clothes because these were often their only clothes, walked up the third-class gangway with hope tempered by exhaustion, by the hardships that had brought them to this moment. Many were Irish, boarding at Queenstown after the ship stopped there. Others were Swedish, Italian, Syrian, Lebanese, from a dozen different countries, speaking a dozen different languages. They would be berthed in the bow and stern, in cabins that by third-class standards of the era were remarkably comfortable, clean, well lit, better than what most of them had known on land. Titanic's third-class accommodations were a point of pride for White Star Line, designed to attract immigrants who had a choice of which shipping line to use. The crew arrived throughout the morning, more than 800 men and women who would operate the ship, serve the passengers, maintain the massive engines and boilers and countless systems that kept such a vessel running. There were engineers who would work in the heat and noise of the boiler rooms, stokers who would shovel coal into the furnaces hour after hour, stewards who would serve meals and make beds and attend to every need of first and second class passengers. There were officers on the bridge who would navigate and command, lookouts who would watch for hazards, wireless operators who would send and receive messages across the vast distances of the Atlantic. The loading continued for hours. Luggage was hoisted aboard by cranes and carried to cabins by sweating stewards. Provisions were loaded through cargo doors, tons of food and drink to feed 2,000 people for a week, from champagne and caviar for first class to potatoes and salt beef for third. Coal was already aboard, thousands of tons of it, loaded over previous days, filling the bunkers that would feed the boilers for the entire crossing. At noon precisely, the ship's whistles sounded. 3 tremendous blasts that echoed across Southampton announced to the city and the world that departure was imminent. On the decks, passengers waved to those gathered on the shore, to family members and friends who'd come to see them off. Handkerchiefs fluttered like white butterflies. Children jumped and pointed, excited beyond measure. Adults stood with arms around each other, some smiling, some tearful, all caught in that peculiar emotion of departure, that mixture of excitement and sorrow that comes with leaving. The tugboats took up their positions, preparing to pull the great ship away from the dock. The mooring lines were cast off, falling away from the bollards with heavy splashes into the harbour water. The ship began to move, slowly at first, barely perceptible, then more noticeably as the tugs found their rhythm and began to pull. There was a commotion as Titanic's bulk created suction in the shallow harbour, pulling at the much smaller American liner New York, moored nearby. The New York's moorings snapped with sounds like rifle shots, and she began drifting toward. Titanic threatened to collide, to damage the great ship before her voyage had even properly begun. But Captain Smith ordered engines reversed, creating a wash that pushed the smaller ship away, and tugboats rushed to secure New York before she could cause harm. It was managed, barely, with only feet to spare. Some took this near collision as an omen, as a warning that perhaps this voyage was ill-fated. But most dismissed such superstition. Ships nearly collided all the time in crowded harbors. It meant nothing. Titanic was safe, unsinkable, bound for glory. A few feet of clearance was enough, more than enough. And so the ship moved out into Southampton water, picked up speed, headed toward the English Channel. On her decks, passengers stood at the railings, watching England recede, watching the tugboats fall away, feeling the ship come alive beneath their feet, feeling the engine's vibration, the slight roll as she met the first ocean swells. They were underway. The voyage had begun. New York lay ahead, 5 days of sailing across calm April seas. They were embarked on an adventure they'd remember for the rest of their lives. They had no idea how true that would prove to be, though not at all in the way they imagined. Life aboard the ship, once clear of Southampton and out into open water, Titanic settled into the rhythm of an ocean liner at cruising speed. The engines thrummed steadily, the propellers churned the water, the ship drove forward at 21 knots, cleaving through the Atlantic swells with barely a tremor. So stable that passengers could balance coins on end on the tables, could carry full glasses without spilling a drop. For the first-class passengers, life aboard Titanic was like life in the finest hotel imaginable. Except this hotel moved, carried you across an ocean, and offered amenities that most hotels could only dream of providing. Their accommodations occupied the best positions on the ship, amidships where the motion was least, on the upper decks where the air was freshest, in cabins and suites that were decorated in styles ranging from Italian Renaissance to Louis XV to Queen Anne, each one a masterpiece of Edwardian craftsmanship and design. The first-class dining saloon occupied 3 decks at the heart of the ship, a room more than 100 feet long, lit by elaborate crystal chandeliers, paneled in carved oak, furnished with tables set with white linens, china bearing the White Star Line crest, silver cutlery, crystal glasses that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow sparkles. Meals were served at appointed times, formal affairs where men wore evening dress and women appeared in gowns and jewels, where the courses came one after another in elegant succession. Oysters and soup, fish and meat, salads and desserts, fruits and cheeses, all accompanied by wines carefully selected from Titanic's extensive cellars. Beyond the dining saloon lay the first-class lounge, a room of remarkable beauty, fitted with furniture upholstered in green leather, walls paneled in carved wood, a fireplace with a mantelpiece of carved marble, the whole space designed to feel like a room in a wealthy country house rather than a chamber on a ship. Men retired here after dinner to smoke cigars and drink brandy, to discuss business or politics or the latest news from the wireless, to enjoy the comfortable companionship of their peers. The first-class smoking room was another male preserve, darker and more intimate than the lounge, fitted with mother-of-pearl inlay and stained glass windows, depicting scenes from history and mythology. Here men played cards, talked in quiet voices, escaped the formality of the public spaces for something more relaxed, more private. For the ladies, there was the reading and writing room, decorated in white with touches of pale green, furnished with writing desks and comfortable chairs. A space where women could spend their afternoons composing letters, reading novels, engaging in the gentle social interactions that filled the days of upper-class Edwardian women. The room was quiet, refined, deliberately feminine in a way that complemented the masculine spaces elsewhere on the ship. The grand staircase was Titanic's showpiece, a sweeping staircase of carved oak that descended through 6 decks, topped by a glass dome that allowed natural light to flood down through the ship's heart. The newel posts were topped with bronze cherubs holding light fixtures. The balustrades were elaborately carved. The whole structure was designed to impress, to awe, to remind passengers constantly that they were sailing on something extraordinary, something unprecedented in the history of maritime travel. There was a gymnasium, fitted with the latest exercise equipment, rowing machines, stationary bicycles, electric horses and camels that simulated the motion of riding. The physical instructor, T.W. Macaulay, was available throughout the day to help passengers work off the effects of the lavish meals. The gymnasium had large windows looking out over the sea, allowing passengers to exercise while watching the ocean roll past. There was a swimming pool, actually called a swimming bath in the terminology of the time, 30 feet long and 14 feet wide, filled with heated seawater, lined with tiles, a luxury almost unheard of at sea. There were Turkish baths with hot rooms and cool rooms and massage tables, designed in Moorish style with blue and red tiles, carved wooden screens, bronze lamps that cast intricate shadows. There was a squash racket court on G-deck, the first ever installed on a ship. The first-class passengers moved through these spaces with the ease of people accustomed to luxury, accepting it as their due, barely noticing the constant attention of stewards who anticipated their every need, who appeared silently to offer drinks or information or assistance, who melted away just as silently when no longer required. Second-class passengers had their own spaces, less grand, but still remarkably comfortable. Their dining saloon was paneled in oak. Their library was well stocked with books and magazines. Their smoke room had mahogany panels and comfortable chairs. They had access to the promenade decks where they could walk in the open air, watch the ocean, feel the wind, enjoy the sense of movement and space that came with an ocean voyage. Many second-class passengers were professionals traveling for business or pleasure, teachers, clergymen, shop owners, managers. They were people of education and culture, even if not of great wealth. They appreciated the comfort of their accommodations, took pleasure in the good meals served in their dining saloon, spent their days reading, playing cards, making conversation with fellow passengers. For many, this voyage represented a significant expenditure, a special occasion, perhaps a honeymoon or a family trip or a business opportunity too important to miss. Third-class passengers, down in the bow and stern, had less luxury, but more life, more vitality, more noise and energy than the formal spaces above. Their dining rooms were simple but clean, fitted with long tables where passengers ate family style, passing dishes, sharing food, making friends with people from a dozen different countries who often couldn't speak each other's languages, but who communicated through gestures and smiles and shared hope for what lay ahead in America. Their cabins were small, often shared by 6 or more people in bunk beds, but they were clean and well ventilated, far better than the dark, airless steerage spaces on older ships. Third-class passengers had access to their own promenade areas on the stern decks, where they could breathe fresh air, watch the wake trailing behind the ship, feel the sun when it broke through the April clouds. In the evenings, third-class passengers made their own entertainment. Someone would produce a violin or an accordion, and music would start, and people would dance, would sing songs from their homelands, would celebrate the fact that they were alive, were healthy enough to travel, were embarked on this great adventure toward new lives in a new world. The children ran and played, chasing each other through the corridors, making friends across language barriers with the universal language of childhood play. Throughout the ship, in all 3 classes, life developed its rhythm, its patterns, its routines. Meals at set times, exercise in the morning or afternoon, cards in the smoke room, books in the library, deck walks in the fresh air, conversations with fellow passengers, sleep in cabins that rocked gently with the ship's motion, that hummed with the constant vibration of the engines, that felt safe and secure and entirely removed from any danger or concern. The ship was a city unto itself, a floating world complete with everything its inhabitants needed: food, shelter, entertainment, companionship. The crew worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, maintaining this world, keeping it running smoothly, ensuring that passengers remained comfortable and unaware of all the labor required to sustain them. In the boiler rooms and engine rooms far below, men worked in heat and noise that passengers never experienced, shoveling coal, tending machines, keeping the great engines turning, keeping the propellers spinning, keeping the ship moving forward at speed toward its destination. The wireless room crackled constantly with messages, dots and dashes translating into words that connected the ship to the wider world, to other vessels, to stations on shore. The operators, Jack Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride, worked long hours sending passenger messages, receiving news, maintaining the invisible web of communication that linked all the world's ships to each other and to land. On the bridge, officers stood watch in rotation, peering ahead into the darkness or sunlight, checking the compass, adjusting course slightly to maintain heading, noting entries in the log. The ship's master, Captain Edward Smith, moved between his cabin and the bridge, between formal dinners with first-class passengers and quiet consultations with his officers, between the social demands of commanding the most prestigious ship in the White Star Line and the serious responsibility of safely delivering more than 2,000 souls across 3,000 miles of ocean. This was life aboard Titanic in those first days of her maiden voyage. Comfortable, orderly, pleasant, entirely routine. Nothing suggested that anything might go wrong, that any danger existed beyond the normal small risks of ocean travel. The ship performed perfectly, exceeded expectations, lived up to all the promises made about her. She was fast, stable, quiet, comfortable. She was, everyone agreed, a magnificent ship, possibly the finest ever built. The passengers settled into their voyage with satisfaction and contentment. New York lay ahead, just a few more days of sailing. The weather was good, the sea was calm, the ship was performing beautifully. Everything was as it should be. Everything was perfect. The voyage begins. The departure from Southampton on April 10th was followed by stops at Cherbourg on the French coast and Queenstown in Ireland. At each stop, more passengers came aboard, the ship's complement growing toward its full capacity. At Cherbourg, many wealthy Americans who'd been touring Europe joined the passenger list, coming out to the ship in tenders since Cherbourg's harbour was too shallow for Titanic to dock. At Queenstown, mostly Irish emigrants boarded, families and young people seeking new lives across the Atlantic, carrying their modest possessions and enormous hopes. By Thursday afternoon, April 11th, all passengers were aboard and Titanic was truly underway, heading west into the Atlantic proper, leaving the last sight of land behind, entering that vast expanse of ocean that separated Europe from America, that 3,000-mile passage that had once taken months in sailing ships, but which Titanic would cross in less than a week. The ocean in April can be unpredictable, but this April was proving remarkably calm. The sea was smooth, barely rippled, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The weather was cold, certainly, with temperatures dropping as the ship moved north and west toward the Great Circle route that would take her past the southern tip of Newfoundland and then southwest toward New York. But the cold was not unpleasant to passengers wrapped in coats and furs, walking the decks, breathing the sharp, clean air, watching the endless ocean roll past. During the day, the ship was a hive of activity. In first class, passengers appeared for breakfast in the dining saloon, greeted acquaintances they'd made in the first days of the voyage, discussed plans for the day ahead. After breakfast, some went to the gymnasium, others to the swimming bath. Still others simply walked the promenade decks, taking their constitutional, enjoying the fresh air and the sense of space. The men often retired to the smoking room, where they read newspapers brought from shore, discussed business and politics, played cards for modest stakes. The women gathered in the reading room, wrote letters, read novels, engaged in the gentle social interactions that structured their days. Children, of which there were many aboard in all three classes, played under the watchful eyes of parents or nannies, ran in the areas designated for them, made friends with other children, adapted to shipboard life with the easy flexibility of the young. Lunch was served at midday, another multi-course affair in first class, simpler but still substantial in second and third. After lunch, there was more time for leisure, for rest, for whatever activities passengers chose. Some napped, lulled by the ship's gentle motion and the heavy food. Others continued their socializing, their reading, their deck walks. The ship's orchestra played in the first-class lounge, light classical music that provided pleasant background to conversation. As afternoon turned to evening, passengers retired to their cabins to dress for dinner, an elaborate ritual in first class where men wore white tie and tails, women wore their finest gowns and most impressive jewelry. Dinner was the social high point of each day, a time to see and be seen, to make impressions, to enjoy not just the food, but the company and the ambiance of these magnificent spaces. After dinner, there was entertainment, more music from the orchestra, conversation in the lounge, cards or billiards in the smoking room, perhaps a turn on the promenade deck for those who enjoyed the night air. Eventually, as the evening grew late, passengers returned to their cabins, prepared for bed, settled into their bunks with books, or simply with their thoughts, listening to the steady thrumming of the engines, the faint creaking of the ship's structure, the occasional footsteps of other passengers or crew in the corridors outside. The crew worked through all of this, invisible to passengers except when needed. Stewards served meals, made beds, responded to every ring of the service bells that passengers used to summon assistance. Engineers and stokers maintained the machinery, kept the boilers fed with coal, monitored temperatures and pressures, ensured that every system functioned as designed. Officers stood their watches on the bridge, tracking the ship's position by sun sights during the day and star sights at night, maintaining course, noting conditions in the log. The wireless operators worked constantly, particularly Jack Phillips, who had hundreds of passenger messages to send. Social correspondence from wealthy passengers to friends and family, business communications that couldn't wait for arrival in New York. The wireless was a novelty still, a modern convenience that the wealthy used casually, unaware of how much work it created for the operators, how many hours Phillips and Bride spent hunched over their equipment, tapping out dots and dashes, copying incoming messages. By Sunday, April 14th, the voyage had settled into comfortable routine. This was the 5th day at sea, with arrival in New York expected Wednesday morning. The ship was making excellent time, pushing forward at high speed despite it being her maiden voyage, despite ice warnings that had been coming in over the wireless since early morning. Ice was not unusual in April in these waters. Every spring, as winter ended, icebergs broke off from Greenland glaciers and drifted south with the Labrador Current, spreading out across the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships reported ice regularly, shared information about where icebergs had been spotted, adjusted their courses when necessary to avoid known ice fields. Titanic had received several ice warnings on Sunday. Other ships reported bergs and pack ice, gave positions, warned that there was unusually large amounts of ice this season, farther south than normal. These warnings were noted. Some were taken to the bridge, some were posted for the captain to see, some were simply acknowledged without particular concern. Ice was a known hazard. Ships dealt with it routinely. Titanic was fast enough to maneuver, strong enough to push through moderate ice, unsinkable enough that even a collision with a berg wouldn't necessarily be catastrophic. The warnings were noted, but didn't prompt any significant change in plans or speed. The day passed like the previous days had passed. Breakfast, activities, lunch, more activities. The slow, pleasant rhythm of an ocean voyage. The weather remained calm, almost perfectly calm, with barely a breath of wind. The sea was smooth as glass, showing none of the usual Atlantic chop or swell. Old-timers among the passengers and crew remarked that they'd never seen the ocean so calm, so perfectly flat and still. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further. By 8 o'clock, it was quite cold on deck. Cold enough that most passengers retreated inside after dinner, rather than taking their usual promenade. The air had that sharp edge that comes with extreme cold, the kind of cold that makes breath visible, that stings exposed skin, that suggests ice nearby even if you cannot yet see it. In the wireless room, another ice warning came in from the Californian, a ship that had stopped for the night because of ice, surrounded by pack ice and bergs, warning that there was heavy ice directly in Titanic's path. But Phillips was busy with passenger traffic, was trying to clear a backlog of messages, and cut off the Californian with a curt reply to stand by. Didn't take the message to the bridge immediately, didn't mark it as urgent. On the bridge, the officer of the watch noted the dropping temperature, noted the extraordinary calm of the sea, passed word to the lookouts in the crow's nest to keep especially sharp watch for ice. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, acknowledged the warning, strained their eyes into the darkness ahead, watched for the white shapes of icebergs against the dark water, against the star-filled sky. But they'd been given no binoculars. The ship's binoculars had been locked away at Southampton, and the key had left the ship with an officer who'd been reassigned at the last moment. The lookouts had to rely on their naked eyes alone, peering into the darkness, hoping to spot ice in time to warn the bridge, in time for the ship to maneuver, in time to avoid what was coming. The night deepened. Passengers retired to their cabins. The public rooms grew quieter. The orchestra finished its final set and packed away instruments. The ship drove on through the dark and the cold at 21 knots, her engines throbbing steadily, her bow cutting the glassy water, her lights blazing from every porthole and window, a floating city moving through absolute darkness towards something that no one yet saw, that no one yet suspected, that was now only minutes away. Sunday, April 14th, the last day. Sunday aboard Titanic began like any other day of the voyage, though it would end unlike any day in maritime history. The ship's passengers woke to another clear morning, another calm sea, another day of the comfortable routine they'd established over the past 4 days. Church services were held in the first-class dining saloon at 10:30, attended by Captain Smith and many passengers, a typical Sunday observance aboard a British liner. The morning passed in the usual way. Breakfast, activities, socializing, the gentle passage of time that comes with ocean travel, when there's nowhere to go and nothing to do but exist in this floating world. The sea remained remarkably calm, flatter than many passengers had ever seen it, stretching out to the horizon like a mirror reflecting the pale sky. By afternoon, the temperature was dropping noticeably. At the officers' meeting, there was discussion of ice warnings that had been coming in since morning. The Coronia had reported ice. The Baltic had sent a message about large icebergs and extensive field ice. The Nordam had warned of much ice. Each message was noted, acknowledged, in some cases shown to Captain Smith, who mentioned casually to passengers that they might be near ice, but that it was nothing to worry about, routine for this time of year in these waters. There was no consideration of slowing down. Titanic was running at nearly full speed, eager to make good time on her maiden voyage, to demonstrate her capabilities, to arrive in New York on schedule, or perhaps even early. The sea was calm. The night would be clear. The lookouts had been warned to watch for ice. Everything seemed under control. As Sunday afternoon turned to evening, passengers began preparing for dinner. In first-class cabins, maids helped ladies into their finest gowns. Men struggled with stiff shirt fronts and bow ties, the formal wear required for Sunday dinner in first class. In second class, passengers dressed more simply but still formally, putting on their best clothes for the Sabbath evening meal. In third class, people wore what they had, but even there, an effort was made to look presentable, to honor the day. The first-class dining saloon was particularly magnificent that evening, lit by hundreds of electric lights in the elaborate chandeliers. The tables set with White Star Line's finest china and crystal. The room filled with well-dressed passengers in high spirits. This was the 5th night at sea, and friendships had been formed, social hierarchies established, the usual structures of Edwardian society replicated in miniature aboard this ship. The meal was lavish, even by Titanic standards. Oysters to start, followed by consommé or cream of barley soup, then poached salmon with mousseline sauce. The main courses included filet mignon, chicken lyonnaise, vegetable marrow farci, roast duckling with applesauce. There were side dishes of chateau potatoes and green peas. For dessert, There was Waldorf pudding, peaches in chartreuse jelly, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, French ice cream. The meal concluded with fresh fruits and cheeses, with coffee and cigars for the men. Captain Smith made his rounds of the first-class tables, chatting with passengers, projecting calm confidence, the image of a master mariner with decades of experience. At some point during the meal, he was shown another ice warning, this one from the Baltic, reporting ice ahead. He acknowledged it, mentioned it to Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, then continued with his dinner. The message was casually passed around among first-class passengers, who found it mildly interesting but not alarming. Ice was part of Atlantic crossings. The ship was unsinkable. The captain had everything under control. After dinner, the usual evening activities commenced. The orchestra played in the lounge. Men retired to the smoking room for brandy and cigars. Some passengers took a final turn on the promenade deck, braving the cold to feel the night air, to see the stars blazing with unusual brilliance in the clear, moonless sky. The Milky Way was a river of light overhead, thousands upon thousands of stars visible in the absence of moon and the clear air of mid-ocean. But the cold drove most people back inside quickly. It was bitter now, well below freezing, the kind of cold that comes when you're near ice, when the air itself carries the chill of frozen water nearby. Passengers retreated to the warm public rooms, to their cabins, seeking comfort and warmth. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips was working feverishly to clear a backlog of passenger messages. The wireless had been out of order earlier in the day, a malfunction that had required repairs, and now he was trying to catch up, to send all the accumulated messages to Cape Race, Newfoundland, the nearest land station. When the Californian, a ship stopped in the ice just a few miles to the north, sent a warning that they were surrounded by ice, Phillips cut them off with a curt instruction to shut up and stand by, to stop interfering with his work. The Californian's wireless operator, offended and tired, shut down his equipment and went to bed. He would not be listening when, an hour later, Titanic would desperately need help. On the bridge, Second Officer Charles Lightoller handed over the watch to First Officer William Murdoch at 10 o'clock. The two men discussed the ice warnings, the temperature, the need for extra vigilance. Lightoller mentioned that if conditions became at all hazy, they should slow down immediately. But conditions weren't hazy. The night was crystalline clear, the sea absolutely flat, visibility perfect except for the absence of moon. If there was ice ahead, surely the lookouts would see it in plenty of time. In the crow's nest, high above the forward deck, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stamped their feet and rubbed their hands, trying to stay warm in the bitter cold. They peered ahead into the darkness, watching for ice, watching for anything unusual, their eyes straining against the dark, looking for the white of icebergs against the black of the sea and sky. Below decks, passengers were preparing for bed. Some were already asleep, lulled by the ship's steady motion and the warmth of their cabins. Others were reading, writing letters, chatting with roommates or family members. In third class, some passengers were still awake and active, music playing, people dancing, enjoying the last hours of Sunday evening. The ship drove on through the night, every light blazing, her engines throbbing steadily, her bow cutting the glassy water. Behind her stretched a wake of white foam, luminescent in the starlight, trailing away into the darkness like a road showing where she'd been. Ahead lay only blackness, the dark ocean merging seamlessly. With the dark sky, no horizon line visible, no way to distinguish where water ended and air began. The ship carried more than 2,000 souls forward into that darkness, passengers sleeping and waking, crew working and resting, all of them trusting in the ship, in the captain, in the technology that made this iron giant possible. They were warm, comfortable, fed, entertained, cared for. They were on the finest ship afloat, under the command of an experienced captain, sailing in weather conditions that were nearly perfect. They had no reason to worry, No cause for concern. Everything was as it should be. The time was approaching 11:40. The ship had perhaps 20 minutes left in which everyone aboard still believed in her invincibility, still trusted absolutely in her safety. 20 minutes in which Titanic was still unsinkable, still immortal, still the triumph of human engineering over nature's forces. 20 minutes until everything changed forever. The night unfolds. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet, standing watch in the crow's nest, saw something ahead. At first, it was just a slight darkening of the darkness, a shadow where no shadow should be, something that didn't look quite right. He stared at it, trying to make sense of what his eyes were seeing, trying to determine if it was real or an optical illusion created by the dark and his tired eyes. Then it became clear, solid, unmistakable. Ice. An iceberg, directly ahead, growing larger by the second as the ship drove toward it at 21 knots. Fleet grabbed the warning bell rope and rang it 3 times, the signal for danger ahead. Then he picked up the telephone to the bridge, heard the voice of 6th Officer Moody answering, and spoke 3 words that would echo through history. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, 1st Officer Murdoch received the warning, looked ahead, saw the berg looming out of the darkness, enormous and terrifying in its proximity. He made instant decisions, calling out orders, trying to do everything at once to avoid the collision that now seemed inevitable. "Hard a starboard," he commanded, which in the nautical terminology of the time meant to turn the ship's bow to port, to the left, away from the berg. At the same time, he ordered the engines full astern, trying to slow the ship, trying to reduce the impact if impact came. But Titanic was enormous, carried tremendous momentum, needed time and distance to turn, to slow. The helm went over, the ship began to respond, her bow starting to swing to port, away from the berg. For a moment, it seemed like it might work, like she might clear the ice, like disaster might be avoided after all. But the berg was too close, the ship too large, the time too short. Even as her bow swung clear, her starboard side, the right side, made contact with the ice. The collision wasn't dramatic, wasn't the cataclysmic crash that might have been expected. It was almost gentle, almost subtle, like the ship was brushing past something, grazing it in passing. The berg towered above the forward deck, a mountain of ice rising higher than the ship's superstructure, blue-white in the starlight. Ancient ice from Greenland glaciers, ice that had been frozen for thousands of years, that had broken away and drifted south, and now, by pure chance, was in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. Below the waterline, where no one could see, the ice scraped along Titanic's side, opening the hull like a can opener, creating not one large hole, but a series of small openings, slits and gaps, separated by intact sections, spread out over nearly 300 feet of the ship's length. The ice scratched and gouged, buckled plates, opened seams, created pathways for water to enter. The collision lasted about 10 seconds. Then the ship was past the berg, leaving it behind in the darkness, continuing forward on her momentum, though her engines had been stopped. On deck, passengers who'd felt the shudder, the strange grinding sensation, came out of their cabins to see what had happened. Some saw the berg receding into the darkness astern. Others saw ice on the forward deck, chunks that had fallen from the berg during the collision, pieces that passengers picked up and played with, tossing them to each other, marveling at how cold they were. Below decks, it was immediately clear that something serious had happened. In the forward cargo holds, water was pouring in through open seams. In Boiler Room 6, the forwardmost boiler room, a split had opened in the hull and seawater was rushing in with tremendous force, flooding the compartment. The stokers working there barely escaped, climbing ladders and running through watertight doors before they could be trapped by the rising water. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was awakened and summoned to inspect the damage. He made his way through the ship, down into the lowest accessible spaces, saw the water rising, saw the opened compartments, saw the extent of the damage. He made quick calculations in his head, calculations he'd done 1,000 times during the design process, but which had always been theoretical, never something he'd expected to use in reality. The calculations were merciless. 5 forward compartments were flooding. The ship was designed to float with any 2 compartments flooded, even with any 3 flooded, but 5 was too many. The weight of water in the forward compartments would pull the bow down, and as the bow went down, water would spill over the top of the forward bulkheads into the next compartment, then the next, in a progressive flood that nothing could stop. Andrews found Captain Smith and delivered the verdict that no one wanted to hear. The ship was going to sink. Not immediately, but inevitably. She had perhaps an hour, maybe 2 at most. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Many people were going to die. Captain Smith received this news with the stoicism of his generation and profession. He'd been at sea for decades, had commanded ships for years, had never lost a vessel, had never been in a situation like this. But he knew his duty. He gave orders to begin preparing the lifeboats, to wake the passengers, to put on life jackets, to move to the boat deck. In the wireless room, he told Phillips and Bride to begin sending distress calls to summon help from any ship within range. Phillips began tapping out the CQD signal, the standard distress call of the time. CQD, 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 SOS, SOS, SOS. The position was given. 41 DG46 in, 50 DG14 W. All ships, come at once. We have struck a berg. We are sinking. The time was just past midnight. Sunday had become Monday. April 14th had become April 15th. The Titanic had been a floating city, warm and bright and full of life. Now she was a sinking ship, taking on water that could not be stopped, beginning a slow slide toward the ocean floor 2.5 miles below. The impossible was happening. The unsinkable ship was sinking. Midnight to 12:30 a.m. The realization that the ship was actually sinking spread slowly through Titanic's passengers and crew. At first, many simply couldn't believe it. The ship felt solid, stable, barely tilted at all. The lights were still on, the electricity still working, the heat still flowing through the radiators. How could a ship that felt so normal, so unchanged, actually be sinking? But the orders were clear. Life jackets were to be put on. Everyone was to proceed to the boat deck. The crew moved through the ship, knocking on cabin doors, calling out instructions, maintaining a calm demeanor, even as they felt the first stirrings of panic themselves. This was Titanic. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it was happening, and they had their duties, their responsibilities to the passengers who trusted them. In first class, the response was mixed. Some passengers took the warning seriously immediately, dressed in warm clothes, put on their life jackets, proceeded to the boat deck as instructed. Others treated it as an inconvenience, an overreaction, possibly even a drill. They dressed slowly, complained about being awakened, questioned whether this was really necessary. The life jackets themselves were awkward, bulky things made of cork and canvas, designed to keep a person's head above water, but uncomfortable to wear. Getting them on over clothes required assistance. Stewards helped passengers figure out how to tie the straps, how to position the jackets properly. Some passengers refused to wear them, found them too undignified, too alarming, a visible admission that danger existed. In second and third class, the warnings took longer to penetrate, particularly in third class where many passengers spoke little or no English, where the accommodations were far from the boat deck, where the labyrinth of corridors and stairs made navigation difficult even in daylight and calm conditions, let alone in the dark with the ship in an emergency. Some third-class passengers found their usual routes blocked by locked gates, barriers installed to keep third class separated from the upper classes, to satisfy immigration requirements that required different classes to be kept apart at sea. Crew members eventually opened these gates, led groups of third-class passengers toward the upper decks, but precious time was lost, time that could have been used to get people into lifeboats. On the boat deck, officers and crew began uncovering the lifeboats, removing the canvas covers, swinging the boats out on their davits, preparing to load passengers. There were 16 standard lifeboats, each capable of holding 65 people, plus 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides that could hold 47 each. In total, the boats could accommodate 1,178 people. There were more than 2,200 people aboard Titanic. The numbers were stark, undeniable. Even if every lifeboat was filled to capacity, more than 1,000 people would have no place in the boats. They would be left on the ship when she went down. They would die. But at this point, just after midnight, most people still didn't understand the severity of the situation. Many boats were lowered half empty because passengers refused to get in, because they felt safer on the big stable ship than in a small boat being lowered 70 feet to the ocean's surface, because they simply couldn't believe the ship was actually sinking. Women and children first became the rule, though different officers interpreted this differently. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller interpreted it strictly. Only women and children in the boats. No men allowed unless absolutely no women or children were available. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch allowed men into boats if no women or children were waiting, trying to fill the boats to capacity, trying to save as many people as possible. The first boat, number 7, was lowered at 12:45 a.m. with only 28 people aboard, less than half its capacity. It could have held 37 more people who would later die. But the passengers still on deck watched it descend and didn't rush to get into the next boat. They still didn't believe. They still trusted that rescue was coming, that another ship would arrive, that this would all turn out to be a scare, but not a tragedy. The ship's orchestra, 8 musicians led by Wallace Hartley, assembled on the boat deck and began to play. At first they played ragtime and popular tunes, cheerful music designed to keep spirits up, to create a sense of normalcy, to suggest that everything was under control. The music drifted across the deck, mingled with the sounds of steam venting from the boilers, with the shouts of officers organizing the boats, with the murmur of passengers talking in low voices, asking questions, trying to understand what was happening. Families were being separated. The women and children first rule meant that husbands and fathers were being left behind, told to wait, told they would get their turn later, told lies meant to comfort, but which both parties knew might not be true. Some women refused to leave their husbands, refused to get into boats without them. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who owned Macy's, represented the choice many faced. Ida was offered a place in a boat but refused, choosing to stay with her husband, to face whatever came together rather than be parted. "Where you go, I go," she told him, and they sat down together on deck chairs, holding hands, waiting for the end. John Jacob Astor helped his pregnant wife Madeline into a boat, asked if he could accompany her given her condition, was refused, stepped back and stood on deck, watching as the boat was lowered away, carrying his wife towards safety while he remained behind to die. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet retreated to their cabins, changed into evening dress, and came back on deck. "We've dressed in our best," he told a steward, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." These stories, these choices, these final moments between people who loved each other, played out across the boat deck as the night deepened, as more boats were loaded and lowered, as the ship settled deeper into the water, as the bow went down and the stern began to rise, as reality slowly, inexorably, forced itself on everyone still aboard. The wireless room continued sending distress calls, over and over, CQD and SOS, the position, the plea for help. Ships responded from across the Atlantic. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, turned and began racing toward Titanic at maximum speed. But she would take hours to arrive, far too long for those who had no place in the boats. The Californian, just a few miles away, sat silent, her wireless operator asleep, her crew unaware that the ship they could see in the distance was firing distress rockets, was sinking, was desperately in need of help. The band played on. 12:30 a.m. to 1:30 a.m. As the first half hour after midnight passed into the next, the reality of the situation became harder to deny. The bow was noticeably lower now, the forward deck tilting down toward the water, the stern rising slightly in compensation. Water had reached the ship's name on the bow, was creeping up the forward decks, was closer, more visible, more undeniably present. More lifeboats were loaded and lowered. Each one represented a small pocket of salvation, a few dozen people who would survive while hundreds of others would not. The officers worked steadily, calling for women and children, helping them into the boats, giving orders to the sailors assigned to man the boats, lowering away into the darkness below. The descent from boat deck to water was 70 feet, the boats swinging and jerking as they went down, the women and children inside clinging to each other, frightened by the height, by the darkness, by the small boat that seemed so fragile compared to the massive ship they were leaving behind. The sailors in each boat worked the ropes, trying to keep the descent smooth, trying to reach the water without incident. Once on the water, the boats pushed away from the ship, rowed by crew members, and sometimes by male passengers who'd been allowed aboard to help manage the boats. They moved perhaps 100 yards away, then stopped, floating on the calm sea, watching Titanic from a distance that felt both too close and too far away. From the boats, the ship was a blaze of light, every window and porthole glowing golden, the whole structure lit up like a building, like a city, impossibly large and bright against the dark ocean and darker sky. It seemed impossible that something so massive, so substantial, so brilliantly lit could actually sink. Yet even from the boats, observers could see the bow going down, could see water climbing the forward decks, could see the stern rising as weight shifted, as the fundamental balance of the ship changed from stable to doomed. On deck, those still aboard faced increasingly difficult choices. The boats were going, one by one, and soon there would be no boats left. Should they jump, risk the 70-foot fall to the water, risk hitting debris or ice, risk being unable to swim in the freezing water, even with life jackets? Should they stay on the ship as long as possible, hoping for another vessel to arrive, hoping for a miracle? Some crew members, knowing the mathematics, knowing how many people remained and how few boat spaces existed, made their own preparations. They threw deck chairs and other floatable items overboard, hoping these might serve as something to cling to when the ship went down. They helped passengers into life jackets, offered reassurance they couldn't truly feel, maintained discipline and order as best they could in circumstances that grew more desperate by the minute. In the wireless room, Phillips and Bride continued sending distress calls. Other ships had responded, promising they were coming, but the distances were too great, the time too short. The Carpathia was the nearest ship responding, but she was still 3 or 4 hours away. Titanic wouldn't last that long. Everyone aboard knew it now, though some still clung to denial, still hoped, still prayed for deliverance that wasn't coming. The Californian, so close she could have been there in less than an hour, sat silent and still, her crew seeing Titanic's rockets but misinterpreting them as signals related to some private matter, perhaps warning other vessels away from ice. Her wireless operator slept. The rockets Titanic fired, regulation distress signals soaring hundreds of feet into the air and bursting in brilliant white stars, went unanswered, unheeded, tragically misunderstood. The band continued playing, though they'd moved from ragtime to hymns now, slower pieces, more solemn music that seemed fitting to the circumstances. Nearer My God to Thee would later be reported as the last piece they played, though witnesses disagreed, some saying it was a waltz, others a different hymn. What was certain was that they played until the very end, creating music in the midst of disaster, giving people something to focus on besides their fear. More boats went into the water. Boat 12, Boat 14, Boat 16. Some were still poorly filled, though as time passed and the danger became more obvious, passengers were more willing to get into boats, less likely to refuse, more likely to understand that the small boat descending to the water was their only chance for survival. Families continued to be torn apart. Husbands kissed wives goodbye, told their children to be brave, watched their families lower away into darkness while they remained behind. Fathers lifted young children into boats, knowing they might never see them again. Women clutched babies and held older children close, seated in the boats, watching as the men they loved stood on deck, growing smaller as the boats descended, silhouetted against the ship's lights. In third class, many passengers were still trying to reach the boat deck, still navigating through the maze of corridors and stairways, still trying to understand what was happening. Some crew members had stayed in steerage, were helping third-class passengers find their way up, opening gates, pointing out routes. But the distance from the bow third-class areas to the boat deck was substantial, the path indirect, and by the time many third-class passengers reached the boats, most were already gone. The inequality of survival was stark, undeniable. First-class women and children had nearly all gotten into boats. Second-class women and children mostly as well. But third-class passengers, particularly men, but also many women and children, found themselves with nowhere to go, no boats available, no options except to wait on the sinking ship and hope for a miracle. The bow was underwater now, the forward well deck submerged, water lapping at the base of the forward superstructure. The ship was down by the head, tilted forward, her stern rising higher out of the water with each passing minute. The time was approaching 1:30. Perhaps an hour remained, perhaps less. The end was coming, rushing toward everyone aboard, with the terrible inevitability of mathematics and physics, water displacing air, weight overcoming buoyancy, a ship dying in the North Atlantic night. 1:30 a.m. to 2:00 a.m. As the clock moved past 1:30, the ship's tilt became pronounced. The forward deck was deeply underwater now, the bow completely submerged, the bridge going under. The stern rose higher, lifting the propellers partly out of the water, creating an angle that made walking difficult, that sent loose objects sliding, that made it clear to anyone still aboard that time was running out. Most of the lifeboats were away now. Only a few remained, including the collapsible boats that were proving difficult to launch. Collapsible A and B were on the roof of the officers' quarters and required special effort to get down to deck level and into the water. As crew members worked on this, the ship continued settling, the water climbing higher, making their task increasingly urgent. Those still on deck, knowing no boats remained for them, began making final preparations. Some jumped, leaping from the deck rails into the water far below, hoping to swim away from the ship to avoid being pulled down when she went. Others climbed higher, moving toward the stern as the bow went under, seeking the highest point, the place that would stay above water longest. The water was unimaginably cold, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing, but kept liquid by its salt content. A person in water that cold would have perhaps 15 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia overwhelmed them, perhaps 30 minutes before death came. Even with a life jacket, even as a strong swimmer, the cold would kill you quickly in that water. People gathered on the stern, hundreds of them now, clustered together, some praying, some crying, some simply standing silent, waiting. The crew worked to maintain order, to prevent panic, though what difference order made at this point was unclear. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait for the water to reach them. The band, incredibly, was still playing. They'd moved to the stern with everyone else, found a place to stand despite the angle of the deck, and continued making music, giving people something to focus on, creating beauty in the midst of horror. The sound of their instruments carried across the water to the boats, the music drifting through the night air, reaching the survivors who sat in the lifeboats watching, listening, unable to help, unable to do anything but witness. Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest, moved among the passengers on the stern, hearing confessions, offering absolution, saying prayers with those who wanted them. He'd been offered a place in a lifeboat twice and refused both times, choosing to stay with those who had no escape, giving them what comfort he could in their final minutes. In the water around the ship, those who jumped were trying to swim away, trying to reach the lifeboats that floated nearby, but which often rowed away, the passengers in them afraid of being swamped by swimmers, afraid of being pulled under by drowning people climbing over each other to get into the boats. The water was so cold it felt like knives, like fire, like something that couldn't be survived. Many died within minutes of entering it, their hearts stopping from the shock, their lungs seizing, their bodies simply shutting down in response to the impossible cold. The wireless room went silent. Phillips and Bride had sent their last messages, could no longer maintain power, could no longer transmit. They abandoned their equipment, made their way out onto deck, joined the others waiting. Phillips would die that night, either in the water or, later, from exposure. Bride would survive, would be one of the last people pulled from the water by the Carpathia the next morning. Captain Smith moved through the ship, checking that everyone had been roused, that all passengers had been given their chance to reach the boats. He returned to the bridge as water climbed the forward superstructure, stood at his post, was later seen swimming briefly before disappearing beneath the water. His body was never recovered. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, standing by the fireplace, his life jacket discarded, staring at a painting on the wall, perhaps thinking about the ship he'd designed, the ship he'd believed was unsinkable, the ship that was now taking more than 1,000 people to their deaths. He made no attempt to save himself, perhaps feeling responsible, perhaps simply unable to face survival when his creation, his masterpiece, was dying. The time was approaching 2 a.m. The ship was nearly vertical now, the stern rising high out of the water, the bow buried deep beneath the surface, the whole massive structure tilted at an angle that seemed impossible, that defied belief even as it happened before the eyes of hundreds of witnesses in the boats. The lights, which had stayed on miraculously until this point, flickered, went out, came back briefly, then failed completely as the generators flooded. Darkness fell over the ship, broken only by starlight, by the faint glow from the boats that had oil lamps lit. The music stopped, the band finally overwhelmed by the angle, by the water, by the impossibility of continuing. In the darkness, people screamed, called out for loved ones, prayed, cried, made whatever peace they could with what was coming. The ship groaned, metal stressing, rivets popping, bulkheads failing under pressure. They were never designed to bear. The sound carried across the water, a metallic scream, a roar, a noise that people in the boats would remember for the rest of their lives. And then, just before the end, the ship's structure failed. She broke in two, the stress concentrating at a weak point between the third and fourth funnels. The stern section separated, fell back into the water briefly, settled back toward level as the bow section pulled free and slid beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths, taking hundreds of people with it. The time was 2:18 a.m. The final minutes. The stern section, freed from the weight of the bow, floated for perhaps 2 minutes, settling back toward horizontal, giving those aboard a brief moment of hope, a brief illusion that perhaps this part might stay afloat, might be saved. But the hope was false. The stern was open to the sea, flooding rapidly through the torn hull, through the massive wound where it had separated from the bow. People clung to railings, to any handholds they could find. Some jumped now, in these final moments, choosing the water over staying aboard. Others held on, hoping against hope, praying for salvation that wasn't coming. The stern began to rise again, more slowly this time, tipping back vertical as water filled the compartments, as weight pulled it down. Higher and higher it rose, lifting hundreds of feet into the air, nearly perpendicular to the surface, a massive tower of steel and wood rising from the ocean like some impossible monument. Those still clinging to the railings, to the deck chairs, to anything they could hold, began to fall, sliding down the now vertical deck, tumbling through the air, falling into the water far below. Their screams carried across the water to the boats, sounds that survivors would hear in nightmares for the rest of their lives. The stern hung there for a moment, vertical, suspended impossibly, silhouetted against the stars. Then it began to slide down, moving at first slowly, then faster, accelerating as it went, disappearing beneath the surface stern first, driving down into the depths, the last of Titanic, vanishing into the ocean. The time was 2:20 a.m. The ship was gone. Where it had been, where more than 2,200 people had been living and laughing just 3 hours earlier, there was now only darkness, only water, only debris floating on the surface, and hundreds of people in the water, most of them already dying from the cold, their screams and cries filling the night. The sound was unbearable. In the lifeboats, survivors covered their ears, trying to block out the screams, the calls for help, the prayers and pleas of people dying in the water. The boats floated perhaps 100 yards from where the ship had gone down, close enough to hear every sound, to hear as the screaming gradually lessened, as voices fell silent one by one, as the cold stopped hearts, as people slipped beneath the surface, as death took them. Some boats rowed back toward the sounds, trying to rescue people from the water. Boat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, picked up 4 people alive, found many more already dead, floating in their life jackets, frozen by the cold. Other boats didn't row back, the passengers in them afraid of being swamped, afraid of drowning people capsizing the boats in their desperation to climb aboard. The screaming lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then silence fell, sudden and complete, and somehow worse than the screaming had been. The silence of death, of hundreds of people who would never speak again, never laugh, never see their families, never complete whatever journeys they'd been on when they boarded Titanic at Southampton just 5 days earlier. In the boats, people sat in shock, wrapped in blankets, shivering from cold and trauma, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. They had left Southampton on the greatest ship ever built, unsinkable, luxurious, the pride of the White Star Line. Now that ship was gone, 2.5 miles beneath them on the ocean floor, and hundreds of people they'd known, had talked to, had dined with, were dead, floating somewhere in the darkness or already sinking to join the wreck. The sea was still remarkably calm, barely rippling, reflecting the stars like a mirror. It was beautiful that night, the sky brilliant with stars, the Milky Way a river of light overhead, the air clear and cold and perfectly still. It seemed wrong somehow that something so terrible could happen on a night so beautiful, that the ocean could be so calm, so peaceful, while such tragedy unfolded upon its surface. The boats drifted, waiting for the Carpathia, which was still 2 hours away, racing toward them at maximum speed, but unable to go any faster, unable to arrive before hundreds of people had already died. In the boats, people tried to stay warm, tried to comfort each other, tried to make sense of what had happened, and failed, because there was no sense to be made, no explanation that could make the tragedy comprehensible. Collapsible B had floated off the ship upside down, and 30 men clung to its overturned hull, standing on it, balancing precariously up to their ankles in the freezing water that washed across it with every ripple. They stood through the rest of the night, shifting weight to keep the boat balanced, knowing that if it capsized, they would all die, that the cold would take them within minutes if they entered the water fully. Among them was 2nd Officer Lightoller, the most senior officer to survive. He organized the men on the capsized boat, had them shift weight in unison to keep balanced, kept them focused on surviving the next minute, then the next, then the next, until finally dawn came and rescue arrived. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of time, the earth turning indifferent to human tragedy, the universe continuing its ancient motions, while hundreds of people died and hundreds more waited in lifeboats for rescue that couldn't come fast enough. After the sinking, the lifeboats drifted through the darkness, clustered together in some areas, separated in others, all of them waiting for the Carpathia, all of them trying to survive the cold, trying to process the trauma, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Some boats were dangerously overcrowded, filled beyond capacity with women and children who huddled together for warmth. Other boats were barely half full, having been lowered before people understood the severity of the situation, before panic set in and made them willing to risk the small boats rather than stay on the seemingly safer ship. In Boat 6, the notorious Margaret Brown, later known as Molly, organized the women to take turns at the oars, to row to stay warm, to maintain some sense of activity and purpose rather than sitting idle in the cold. The male crew member in charge of the boat protested, said it wasn't proper, but Brown overruled him, took an oar herself, and led by example. In Boat 1, designed to hold 40 people, there were only 12 aboard. 5 first-class passengers and 7 crew members. It had been lowered early, when people still didn't understand the situation, when the boat deck was still relatively empty. Those 12 people had taken up space that 48 others could have occupied. 48 people who later died because this boat left mostly empty. The inequity of survival was staggering. Of the approximately 325 first-class passengers, around 200 survived, a survival rate of more than 60%. Of the roughly 285 second-class passengers, only about 119 survived, around 42%. Of the some 710 third-class passengers, only about 174 survived, less than 25%. The differences reflected the locations of accommodations, the faster evacuation of upper decks, the confusion and locked gates that delayed third-class passengers from reaching the boats. For crew members, the survival rate was about 24%, with most survivors being those who worked on deck or in passenger areas. Those who worked below, in the engine rooms and boiler rooms, died in higher proportions, trapped below when the compartments flooded, or stayed at their posts keeping the lights on, keeping the pumps running, doing their duty until the water rose too high and escape became impossible. The cold was extreme. Even in the boats, with dry clothes and blankets, people were freezing, shivering uncontrollably, at risk of hypothermia. Children cried, then fell silent, then slept or slipped into hypothermic stupor. Adults tried to keep them warm, rubbed their limbs, wrapped them in every available piece of clothing, anything to maintain body heat, until rescue arrived. Time passed with excruciating slowness. The boats had no clocks, no way to mark time except the stars, the slow turning of constellations overhead. Some people tried to sing, to keep spirits up, to fill the silence with something other than sobs and prayers. Others sat mute, shocked into silence by what they'd witnessed, by what they'd lost, by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. The Carpathia, racing through ice fields at speeds her captain would never have normally attempted, pushed her elderly engines to their limits. Captain Rostron had turned his ship the moment he received Titanic's distress call, had ordered every available coal stoker to the furnaces, had prepared his ship to receive hundreds of survivors, had organized his crew and his passenger spaces to handle the influx of traumatized, cold, possibly injured people they'd be rescuing. At 3:30 a.m., the Carpathia began firing rockets to signal her approach. In the lifeboats, people saw the lights on the horizon, saw the rockets, felt the first stirrings of hope. Rescue was coming. They would survive. They would see morning. As the sky began to lighten toward dawn, the full horror of the situation became visible. Debris floated everywhere. Deck chairs, wooden panels, cork from life jackets, personal belongings, bodies. The bodies floated in their life jackets. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, scattered across the water like fallen leaves, their faces pale, their bodies still, frozen by the water that had killed them. The survivors looked away, couldn't bear to see the dead floating past, couldn't bear to wonder if one of those bodies might be someone they knew, someone they'd talked to at dinner, someone they'd said goodbye to when the boats were being loaded. At 4 a.m., the Carpathia arrived. She stopped in the ice field, surrounded by bergs that hadn't been visible in darkness, but which now appeared in the growing light. Massive and numerous and beautiful and terrible. Frozen mountains drifting in the current, any one of which could sink a ship, just as one had sunk Titanic just hours before. The lifeboats began rowing toward the Carpathia, toward the rope ladders being lowered down her sides, toward the crew members waiting to help, toward the warm ship, toward safety, toward survival. One by one, they came alongside, and passengers climbed the ladders or were pulled up in slings. Children passed up into waiting arms, women helped aboard, men following, everyone shivering, shocked, traumatized, but alive. The rescue took 4 hours. Boat by boat, the Carpathia gathered the survivors, bringing them aboard, taking them below to warm rooms, to hot drinks, to blankets and medical care. The last boat picked up was Collapsible B, with the men still standing on its overturned hull, balancing desperately, barely conscious from cold and exhaustion. They were pulled aboard just in time. Minutes later, they would have lost consciousness, fallen into the water, died so close to rescue. When the last survivor was aboard, Captain Rostron held a brief service on deck, committing the souls of the dead to God's care, offering prayers for those who'd died and those who'd survived. Then he turned his ship and began the journey back to New York, carrying 705 survivors toward a world that was about to learn of the disaster, that would be shocked, horrified, unable to believe that the unsinkable ship had sunk, that so many had died, that the triumph of technology had proven so fragile in the face of ice and ocean. Behind them, the ice field continued drifting south. The bergs floated on, indifferent, slowly melting as they moved toward warmer water, gradually disappearing, taking with them all physical evidence of what they'd done, of the ship they'd destroyed, of the 1,500 people who'd died because Titanic and that one particular berg had occupied the same space at the same moment on a calm April night. Drifting to sleep. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this journey, this voyage back through time to 1912, to the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, to the night when the impossible happened and the world learned once again that human confidence, human technology, human pride must always bow before nature's power, before the ocean's depth, before the cold and the ice, and the simple physics of water and steel. Let your body relax now, sinking deeper into your bed, into your pillows, into the comfort of your own space that is so far removed from that cold Atlantic night. Let your breathing slow, become steady and deep, the rhythm of rest, the cadence of sleep approaching, the tide of consciousness beginning to ebb. The Titanic lies still on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles down, resting in darkness and cold that are absolute. She has been there for more than a century now, slowly being claimed by the ocean, slowly dissolving back into the elements that made her, rust and decay, transforming steel into iron oxide, wood rotting away, artifacts scattering. The ship that was so grand, so bright, so full of life, now rests in silence and darkness, a grave for those who went down with her, a monument to human ambition and human fragility. Your breathing slows further, your thoughts beginning to drift, to soften, to lose their sharp edges. Think about time, how 1912 is long past, how everyone who sailed on Titanic is gone now, how their stories are complete, their journeys ended. The fear they felt has passed. The cold has passed. Only the memory remains, and even that is fading as the years accumulate, as the living witnesses disappear, as the disaster becomes history, becomes story, becomes something that happened long ago to people who are no more. You're very relaxed now, your body heavy, your limbs barely feeling the bed beneath them, the boundaries between where you end and the world begins growing indistinct, blurring. fading. You're floating, drifting, like a boat on calm water, gentle and supported, rocked by currents you cannot see, guided by forces you don't need to understand. Think about the survivors, the 705 people who reached the Carpathia, who made it to New York, who carried their stories forward into long lives. Most of them rarely spoke about that night, found it too painful, too traumatic, too incomprehensible to put into words. They lived their lives, raised families, worked their jobs, existed in the ordinary world of daylight and routine, but always they carried the memory of that night, of the ship going down, of the screams in the darkness, of the impossible cold, of the fact that they had survived when so many others had not. But they did survive. They went on. Life continued. The tragedy was enormous, but it didn't stop the world, didn't end human endeavor, didn't prevent other ships from sailing, other voyages from being undertaken. We learned from it, changed regulations, required enough lifeboats for everyone, improved wireless communications, established iceberg patrols, made ships safer. The tragedy bought knowledge with blood and cold water, taught lessons that have saved lives in the decades since. Your eyes are closed, have been closed, or perhaps they're closing now. The effort of keeping them open too much, unnecessary, unwelcome. Darkness is gathering around you, comfortable. Darkness, warm darkness. The darkness of your bedroom, your safe space, your sanctuary. Not the cold darkness of the Atlantic, not the terrifying darkness of a sinking ship, but gentle darkness, welcoming darkness, darkness that offers rest and peace and the promise of morning to come. Sleep is very close now, right at the threshold, waiting to receive you, patient and kind. One more breath, one more moment of drifting, one more gentle release of consciousness, and you'll cross over. You'll sink into sleep as gently as a boat settles onto calm water, as softly as snow falling on a winter night. The story is complete. The voyage is ended. The ship is gone. The survivors are gone. Even the ocean that witnessed it all continues unchanged, rolling through its eternal cycles, connecting continents, hosting life, indifferent to human tragedy as it's indifferent to human triumph. The ocean is vast and we are small, and the Titanic was proof of both our ingenuity and our limitations, our ability to build wonders and our inability to control all outcomes, our confidence and our fragility. But you are safe, you are warm, you are here, in this moment, in this bed, in this time that is separated from 1912 by more than a century, by changes in technology and society that would seem like magic to those who sailed on Titanic. You are safe, and you can let go now, can release the day's concerns, can stop thinking, stop worrying, stop being awake. Sleep is here, enfolding you, drawing you down, taking you into rest that is deep and complete and restorative. Dream softly if you dream at all. Rest deeply, whether dreams come or not. Let the story of Titanic settle into memory. Join all the other stories you know, all the history you carry, all the knowledge you hold about the world and how it works and how fragile everything always is. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, rested, ready for your own voyage through another day. But tonight, you sleep. Tonight, you drift. Tonight, you let go completely and trust that morning will come as it always comes, that the sun will rise as it rose the morning after Titanic sank, that life continues despite tragedy, despite loss, despite everything. Good night, dear listener. Sleep peacefully. Rest completely. And remember that every voyage ends, every story concludes, every life comes to its close. But that makes each moment precious, each breath valuable, each day a gift to be lived fully and gratefully. If you found comfort in this journey through history, if this story helped you drift toward restful sleep, please consider liking this video. Subscribe to travel with me through more distant times and forgotten nights, through history told gently, told for rest, told for peace. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you learned, what moved you, what other stories you'd like to hear. Until next time, sleep well, dream softly, and may all your voyages, real or imagined, end safely, with everyone you love beside you, with no cold water, no dark night, no tragedy to mark their passage. Good night.